The tech world isn't for dabblers. The words cut through the warm, gravy-scented air of our family's Thanksgiving dinner. My brother Leo let the declaration linger, his wine glass held aloft like a scepter. He was performing, as he always did, the golden child with the MIT degree and the impressive title at a Boston tech giant. His smirk slid across the sprawling oak table and landed squarely on me. It was a look I knew well, one I'd been weathering for over a decade, a carefully calibrated blend of pity and condescending amusement. The polite chuckles that followed from my aunts and uncles were practiced, a familiar chorus. My mother gave a proud, approving smile. I was the family's quiet letdown, the one with the little computer project. I felt the usual burn creep up my neck, but kept my face a perfect mask of indifference, tracing the intricate pattern of an autumn leaf on my plate. They had no idea what was about to happen, but from the head of the table, my 84-year-old grandmother, Eleanor, caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She knew, and before the pumpkin pie was served, she would detonate his entire world with 9 simple words that would permanently redraw the map of our family. My name is Clara Evans, and for most of my life, to my family, that was where the sentence ended. No impressive titles followed, no glowing adjectives were attached. I was just Clara. My brother, however, was never just Leo. He was Leo, the MIT prodigy. Leo, the senior director at Innovatech. Leo, the one who had followed the family blueprint for success to the letter. Our family had a blueprint, a meticulously drafted guide to a worthy life, and I'd apparently used my copy for scrap paper before I was out of high school. The great divergence of our lives started early. Leo seemed to have been born with a compass that pointed directly toward achievement. In school, he was the mathlete captain, the one with the flawless GPA, the kid whose hand was always in the air. When his acceptance letter from MIT arrived, my parents acted like he'd won the Nobel Prize. I can still picture my father, his face radiating a kind of pride I'd never seen aimed at me, slapping Leo on the back and booming to the entire room, "This is it. He's made." My mother had the acceptance letter professionally framed, and it still hangs in the main hallway of their house. It's not just a piece of paper. It's a monument to their success, a testament to their superior parenting. Leo had fulfilled the dream. His journey from there was a frictionless glide on a bullet train. He graduated with high honors and had a job waiting for him at Innovatech before he'd even packed up his dorm room. The company was a titan in Boston's tech scene, a name that commanded instant respect. He bought a sleek condo in the seaport with a view of the harbor, and my parents helped him with a hefty down payment, calling it a sound investment. When they spoke of him, their voices held a note of reverence. "Leo's team is pioneering a new AI integration this quarter," my mom would report on our weekly calls, as if announcing a diplomatic breakthrough. "The pressure he's under is incredible," my dad would add, shaking his head with a mixture of worry and awe. Every minor accomplishment of his was treated as a family milestone. He was their validation, the living embodiment of their belief that they had done everything right. My own path wasn't a path. It was more like a stumble through an unlit forest. I didn't have the grades for a place like MIT. Truthfully, I never had the desire. My fascination was with the clean, quiet logic of coding, the world behind the screen where rules were absolute and creativity had a tangible structure. This particular interest wasn't on the family blueprint, so I enrolled in a local community college, taking programming courses at night. My parents paid the tuition, but with a weary sense of resignation, as if they were funding a slightly mystifying and prolonged hobby. During the day, I paid my rent on a tiny apartment over a noisy diner by working in a sprawling warehouse, packing boxes for an online retailer. My life smelled of cardboard and industrial cleaning fluid. I spent my days under the soul-crushing hum of fluorescent lights, scanning barcodes and lifting boxes. The work was mindless, a physical exhaustion that left my mind free to wander, tracing algorithms and debugging imaginary code while my hands did the repetitive work. My coworkers were good people, but their horizons were fixed on the immediate, getting through the next 8 hours, making it to Friday. I felt like a spy living a secret life. As soon as my shift ended, I'd race home, wolf down a sad dinner, and then my real day would start. I'd power up my beat-up secondhand laptop, and the rest of the world would melt away. The steady click-clack of the keyboard was the soundtrack to my life. I devoured new programming languages, built small, useless applications just to see if I could, and started taking on minuscule freelance jobs I found on obscure forums. I was building a new reality for myself, one line of code at a time, in the dead of night. These were the triumphs no one in my family ever witnessed. They never saw the pure elation of finally solving a bug that had plagued me for days. They never saw the thrill of getting my first $200 payment from a local bakery for building them a simple ordering website. To them, my life was a holding pattern, and my work was a cute distraction. I'll never forget the cadence of my phone calls with my mom. She'd spend the first 20 minutes giving me a breathless, detailed rundown of Leo's latest successes. A brilliant presentation, a promotion, his new company car. Then her voice would shift, softening with a familiar, gentle pity. "So, how are things with you, honey? Still tinkering with that little computer project of yours?" A little computer project. She said it so often it became my unofficial family designation. When she introduced me at social gatherings, it was always with a hesitant, apologetic smile. "This is my daughter, Clara. She's finding her own way." Then she'd turn to someone else and her voice would swell with pride. "And my son, Leo, is a senior director at Innovatech." The whiplash of that contrast was a fresh sting every single time. I was a question mark. He was an exclamation point. My dad's disapproval was quieter but somehow heavier. He wasn't overtly dismissive like my mom or cruel like Leo. He was just absent. His lack of interest was a thick, suffocating blanket. I remember one evening vividly. I had just landed my first major contract, a project big enough that I could finally quit the warehouse. I was vibrating with excitement. I drove to my parents' house and sat them down at the kitchen table, trying to explain what it meant. I talked about the logistics software I was contracted to build, the complex problems it would solve for a mid-sized shipping company. He listened, or at least he looked in my direction, nodding blankly. His eyes had that far-off, glazed look. When I finally ran out of steam, he cleared his throat and said, "Well, that's nice, Clara." Say, "Did Leo tell you his team just secured another round of funding? His stock options are going to be worth a fortune." In that instant, I finally understood. It didn't matter what I accomplished. The screen I was building my life on would always be too small for them to see, because their eyes were permanently blinded by the stadium floodlights shining on my brother. The feeling of being invisible to your own family is a strange, hollow ache. For a long time, their dismissal was a poison that fed a deep-seated self-doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just playing games. Maybe this passion was just a way to avoid the real world I was so clearly failing to navigate. But somewhere in the late hours, fueled by cheap coffee and pure, unadulterated stubbornness, a different feeling started to take root: defiance. My work was no longer just about passion. It became a mission. It was about building something so real, so solid, so undeniably successful that they would have no choice but to finally open their eyes. I founded my own company, LogIFlow. I rented a tiny, grim office. I hired my first employee. I pushed myself through 90-hour work weeks, and through all of it, to my family, I was still just Clara, the girl with the little computer project. They had no idea I was building an empire in the shadows of their indifference, and I was getting ready to flip the switch. Every family has its rituals. Some bond over football on Sundays, others have sacred camping trips. My family had Thanksgiving dinner. On the surface, It looked idyllic. My mother would spend 2 days prepping her famous sage and butter rubbed turkey. My father would polish the family silver and bring out the good china. The house would fill with the warm, nostalgic sense of roasting poultry, sweet potatoes, and baking spices. But the warmth was a thin veneer. Thanksgiving dinner wasn't a family gathering. It was the annual Evans family shareholder meeting, and we were all involuntary participants. The agenda never changed. Extended family would arrive in their holiday finest, and after a perfunctory exchange of pleasantries, the conversation would pivot directly to business. It wasn't about connecting, it was about measuring. Dad would pour his signature single malt scotches, always a little too generously, and the air would thicken with polite, professional one-upmanship. My Uncle Robert would hold forth on his quarterly sales targets. My Aunt Carol would casually drop the name of a high-profile client her law firm had just landed. Job titles, bonuses, promotions, and stock portfolios were the official currency of our family. Affection and support were traded on a much less active, far less valuable exchange. My father was the de facto chairman of these proceedings. He'd stand by the fireplace, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, and steer the conversation with the practiced skill of a seasoned moderator. He took a deep, genuine pride in this tradition. I think he truly believed this was how successful families operated. They didn't bother with messy, unproductive emotional chatter. They discussed results. And after the opening round of reports from the aunts and uncles, he would inevitably turn the floor over to the keynote speaker, the main event, his son. "Leo," he'd say, his voice resonating with pride, "bring us up to speed. What's happening on the front lines of the tech world?" And Leo would begin his annual address. He called it his State of the Union, and he delivered it with the smooth, rehearsed confidence of someone who had practiced in front of a mirror. He'd lean back in his chair, making deliberate eye contact with everyone at the table, except for me, and weave a grand narrative of his indispensable role at Innovatech. He used a specialized vocabulary, a dialect designed to simultaneously impress and exclude. He spoke of synergizing cross-functional teams, leveraging core competencies for maximum ROI, and disrupting legacy systems with next-gen platforms. The family would listen with rapt attention, nodding sagely as if they understood every word. My mother would watch him, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated adoration. The climax of his speech was always his sermon on the brutal, meritocratic nature of his industry. "It's not a world for everyone," he'd say, shaking his head with a show of solemn gravity. "The pressure is immense. You need the right background, the right education. You need the pedigree just to get a foot in the door." And then, like clockwork, it would come. As he said the word pedigree, his eyes would finally flick toward me. It was never a long stare, just a brief, sharp glance, like a quick, painful jab. It was a perfectly executed maneuver, designed to achieve two things at once: to subtly remind everyone at the table of my community college certificate and my history of packing boxes, and to dare me to say a word in my own defense. It was a silent, public dismissal of my entire existence. "You don't belong in this conversation," the look said. "You will never understand this world. You are not one of us." My strategy for surviving these annual performance reviews was to become a ghost. I had mastered the art of making myself small, of folding into the background. While Leo held court, I became the designated plate clearer, the drink refiller. I would busy myself in the kitchen, where the clatter of pots and pans was a welcome shield. When the spotlight inevitably, briefly, swung to me, and an uncle would ask out of polite obligation, "So, Clara, what have you been up to?" I would deliver the vaguest, most non-committal answer possible. "Oh, you know, staying busy, same old." I'd offer a small, tight smile and immediately deflect. "Mom, this turkey is incredible. How do you get the skin so crispy?" Inside, a war was raging. The things I wanted to say would rise in my throat, hot and acidic. I wanted to tell them about the complex logistics platform I was architecting. I wanted to tell them about the client who told me my software had literally saved his small business from going under. I wanted to scream that what I was building was harder, riskier, and more meaningful than anything Leo had ever done in his cushioned corporate cocoon. But I swallowed the words, every single time. I had learned from bitter experience that they would fall on deaf ears. I had tried once a few Thanksgivings ago. I was buzzing with pride over a particularly elegant algorithm I had designed. It was a small but significant breakthrough for my then fledgling company. When my father asked what was new, I took a deep breath and decided to try. I started to explain the concept of route optimization, how my code could save trucking companies millions in fuel costs. I watched their eyes glaze over within seconds. My father nodded politely, but his focus was a million miles away. My mother just looked confused. Before I could finish, Leo let out a short, condescending chuckle. "It's cute that you're learning the lingo, Clara," he'd said, patting my hand as if I were a 5-year-old showing him a crayon drawing. "But it's a bit more complicated in the real world. We have entire teams of PhDs from Caltech working on that kind of problem at Innovatech." The conversation moved on. My breakthrough was framed as a child's art project. The sting of that humiliation was a scar I never forgot. After that, I never tried again. I learned that my silence was my only armor. My silence protected the precious, fragile world I was building. Their ignorance was the fence that kept my dreams safe from their judgment. So I sat through each Thanksgiving dinner, a silent observer at my own family's tribunal. I ate my turkey and stuffing, smiled when prompted, and counted the seconds until I could escape. Each year, the knot of dread in my stomach would start tightening a week before the holiday. This year, though, was different. The dread was still there, a familiar ache, but it was mixed with something else, something sharp, thrilling, and utterly terrifying. It was anticipation, because this year I had a secret. And for the first time, my silence wasn't just my armor, it was my weapon. In the loud, competitive theater of my family, my grandmother, Eleanor, was the quiet audience member who saw everything. While everyone else was fixated on the performers on stage, she sat in the back row, watching, listening, and understanding all the lines that were never spoken. She was 84, but her eyes were sharper and saw more truth than anyone else's. My parents valued status and shiny credentials. My brother valued dominance and external praise. Grandma Eleanor valued substance. She was the only one in my family who had ever taken the time to look beneath the surface of my life. Our bond was forged in the quiet moments, far from the judgmental glare of the rest of the family. It was cemented the day she came to visit my first office. I use the term loosely. It was a windowless 10 by 10 foot room I rented in the back of an industrial park, wedged between a welding shop and a plumbing supply warehouse. The paint was peeling. One of the overhead fluorescent bulbs flickered constantly, and my desk was an old wooden door I'd laid across 2 filing cabinets. In the corner, a rack of secondhand servers I'd bought with my meager savings hummed and whirred, putting out an incredible amount of heat. It was, by all accounts, a pathetic sight. When I told my parents I'd quit the warehouse to pursue my company full-time from this space, their reaction was what I expected. My mother was horrified. "But Clara, what about your health insurance? What about a 401k?" she'd asked, her voice tight with anxiety. My father came to see it once. He stood in the doorway for less than 60 seconds, his eyes scanning the cramped room with a look of profound disappointment. "Well," he'd said, clearing his throat, "it's a start, I suppose." He never came back. Leo, of course, found it hilarious. He called it my operations hub and sarcastically asked if my Wi-Fi was strong enough to support all my important projects. But then Grandma Eleanor came. She'd taken a bus across town without telling anyone. She walked in, her purse tucked neatly under her arm, and surveyed the room. I braced myself for the gentle pity, for the suggestion that maybe it was time to look for a real job. But it never came. She didn't comment on the peeling paint or the makeshift desk. Instead, she walked right over to my monitor, which was filled with dense lines of code. She pointed a steady, wrinkled finger at a block of text. "What does this part do?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. I was so taken aback I could barely form a sentence. I started to explain, trying to simplify the technical jargon, but she cut me off. No, tell me the real story," she said. So I did. I showed her the architecture of the logistics system I was building. I explained how it would help small, family-owned businesses manage their inventory and shipping more efficiently. She listened, nodding slowly, her eyes sharp and focused. When I finished, she didn't say, "That's nice, dear." She said, "So you're building a tool to help the little guys stand up to the giants. That's a noble thing, Clara." She saw it. She saw the vision, not the shabby walls that contained it. Before she left, she placed a thermos on my desk. It was filled with hot chamomile tea with a spoonful of honey, just the way I liked it. "You're working too hard," she said. "Don't forget to eat." That simple gesture, that recognition of my struggle and my dream, felt more validating than all the praise my parents had ever heaped on Leo. From that day forward, her small, quiet house became my refuge. We developed our own ritual. On Sunday afternoons, I'd go to her kitchen, and we'd drink chamomile tea while I practiced my business pitches. Her small kitchen table became my first boardroom. I was terrified of public speaking, of trying to sell my vision to potential clients and investors. Grandma Eleanor, who had never worked a day in a corporate office, became my unlikely coach. She'd play the part of a skeptical CEO. I'd launch into my nervous, rambling presentation, and she'd interrupt with sharp, insightful questions. "Why would anyone pay for this, Clara? There are bigger companies that do something similar. You keep using all those $50 words. Explain it to me like I'm a human being." "You're not selling software," she told me one afternoon, her voice firm. "You're selling peace of mind. You're selling them a way to get home to their families an hour earlier. Sell them that." She didn't understand a line of my code, but she understood people. She understood value. She helped me find the human story buried inside the cold logic of my business. She was my company's first real investor, not with money, but with something far more precious, her belief. So when the biggest moment of my professional life arrived, she was the only person I could tell. The deal to acquire the Enterprise Solutions division of Innovatech had been a whirlwind of clandestine meetings, frantic late-night calls with lawyers, and sleepless nights. I was bound by a strict non-disclosure agreement, but the weight of the secret was crushing me. I was about to buy a piece of the very company my brother used as his golden pedestal, the company that represented everything my family admired. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. The day the papers were finalized, I drove straight to her house. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where we'd rehearsed all those pitches, and I laid the documents in front of her. My hands were shaking. "I did it, Grandma," I whispered. Logiflow is acquiring the Enterprise Solutions division of Innovatech. She put on her reading glasses and read the document, her finger tracing the names of the companies. She looked up at me, and there were no gasps of shock, no exclamations of surprise. There was just a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. It was a smile of immense, quiet pride. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She understood the beautiful surgical justice of it all. She was my co-conspirator. We sat there for an hour planning for Thanksgiving dinner. It was her idea to wait for the official press embargo to lift at 7 p.m. "Let Leo have his performance," she'd said, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Let them all have their say. Dessert, my dear, always tastes sweeter when you've earned it." She was right. She was always right. We were back at the Thanksgiving dinner table. The remnants of the main course, the skeletal carcass of the turkey, a few stray Brussels sprouts, a smear of cranberry sauce on my father's plate, were being cleared away by my mother. The air in the dining room was heavy and warm, thick with the smell of cooked food, the lingering aroma of scotch, and the suffocating weight of my brother's ego. He was in his element, leaning back in his chair with a glass of expensive Cabernet, holding court as the undisputed king of the Evans family. His sermon, which had started during the turkey, was now reaching its grand finale. He was pontificating on the state of the tech industry, and every word was a monument to his own brilliance and a subtle jab at my perceived lack of it. "The problem today," he announced, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, "is that the barriers to entry have been lowered too much. You have all these people who think they can watch a few online tutorials, learn a bit of Python, and call themselves an engineer. It's an insult to the entire profession." He scanned the table, ensuring he had everyone's undivided attention. My uncles were nodding along, their faces grim and serious. My father looked on proudly as if Leo were a tenured professor delivering a guest lecture. "It just doesn't work that way," Leo continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "To build something real, something scalable, you need a foundation. You need the kind of theoretical framework you only get at a top-tier institution. You need to be immersed with the best and the brightest. At a place like Innovatech, the person in the cubicle next to you is a genius who graduated top of their class from Stanford. The person down the hall has 3 patents to their name. We push each other. It's an ecosystem of excellence." Every word was a polished stone aimed directly at me. Top-tier institution, ecosystem of excellence. He was building a fortress of superiority around himself and pointing out that I was on the outside peering through the bars. I kept my eyes fixed on my empty plate, my hands clenched into tight fists in my lap to keep them from shaking. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm that felt loud enough for the whole table to hear. I tried to take a slow, steadying breath, but the air felt too thick to enter my lungs. The self-doubt that had been my shadow for so many years was whispering its familiar poison in my ear. What if you're wrong? What if he's right? What if this all blows up in your face and you just look like an even bigger fool? I felt a desperate urge to bolt, to flee the room before the moment of truth arrived. But then I glanced up and caught my grandmother's eye. She was watching Leo, her expression perfectly neutral, but I could see the subtle calculation behind her gaze. She was a master conductor, subtly guiding her orchestra of oblivious fools. Every few minutes, she would toss Leo another leading question, a gentle prompt designed to keep him talking, to encourage him to build his pedestal of arrogance just a little bit higher. "That sounds incredibly complicated, Leo," she said, her voice a picture of grandmotherly awe. "You must be very important to the company to handle all that pressure." His chest puffed out. "It's a lot, Grandma, but someone has to do it. Leadership is about making the tough calls." As he spoke, Grandma Eleanor calmly lifted her wrist and checked her vintage watch. It was a beautiful, old-fashioned timepiece with a worn leather strap that had belonged to my grandfather. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with a quiet power. She wasn't anxious or rushed. She was in complete and utter control. She met my gaze across the table, over the heads of our unsuspecting family, and gave me the slightest of smiles. It was a silent message, a final reassurance. Patience, it's almost time. The grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime, its deep, resonant tones marking 6 o'clock. An hour to go. The minutes that followed stretched into an eternity. My mother began serving dessert, her famous pumpkin pie with a dollop of freshly whipped cream. The familiar, comforting smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the room. The clinking of forks against fine china was the only sound for a moment. This small domestic ritual, a scene that had played out at every family gathering my entire life, felt utterly surreal. It was the calm before the storm, the deep breath before the plunge. The time on the mantelpiece clock read 6:55. 5 minutes left. My entire body was vibrating with a nervous energy that was almost painful. I took a bite of pie, but it tasted like chalk in my mouth. I could feel Leo's eyes on me again. He was enjoying my discomfort, my silence. He thought he had won, just like he always did. The clock in the hall ticked, each second landing like a hammer blow. It was a countdown to the end of my life as the family disappointment, and it was just moments away. The dessert plates were now decorated with the ghosts of pumpkin pie and smeared whipped cream. The initial flurry of post-meal chatter had died down, leaving a comfortable, sleepy lull in its wake. My father swirled the last of the scotch in his glass, his eyes slightly unfocused. My mother was discussing a neighbor's new landscaping with my aunt. The room was filled with the low murmur of tired conversation, the gentle clinking of coffee cups, and the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the front hall. To everyone else, it was the peaceful end of a holiday meal. To me, it was the most deafening sound in the world. Each tick was a hammer blow counting down the final minutes of my old life. My hands were freezing cold, so I tucked them under my legs. My breathing was shallow, a series of tiny sips of air that weren't enough to calm the frantic beating of my heart. I kept my eyes on my grandmother. She was the picture of serenity, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. She had not rushed a single moment of this dinner. She had let the entire predictable performance play out, giving each actor just enough rope to hang themselves. She placed her cup back on its saucer with a soft click. Then she turned her head, her gaze sweeping past my mother and settling on Leo. Her expression was one of polite, grandmotherly interest, the same look she'd have if she were asking him about the weather. "Leo," she began, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the low hum of conversation. "You mentioned your work at Innovatech. What is it that your division does exactly?" Leo, who had been looking bored and scrolling on his phone, straightened up, always happy to be the center of attention again. A small, self-important smile touched his lips. "We're Enterprise Solutions," he said, his voice taking on its familiar lecture tone. "Basically, we're the backbone of the company. We handle the big corporate clients, the Fortune 500s. It's not the flashy consumer-facing stuff. It's the serious, high-stakes architecture that actually keeps the lights on. The real money, the real power, it's all in enterprise. We generate the most stable revenue for the entire corporation." He said the word corporation with a certain reverence, as if he were a high priest describing his temple. He was framing his job not as work, but as a noble, essential calling that only a select few were qualified to perform. My grandmother nodded slowly, as if processing this vital information. "It sounds very important," she said, her tone perfectly even. Then she delivered the next line, a question so soft and innocent it was like a feather floating through the air, about to land on a stick of dynamite. "How is the morale over there these days?" Leo's smile faltered for just a second. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. It was a silly question, a sentimental, out-of-touch query from an old woman who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of his world. He quickly recovered, letting out a short, dismissive laugh and waving his hand in the air as if swatting away a fly. "Oh, you know how it is in a big company," he said, with a sigh of feigned weariness. "There are always rumors of restructuring, corporate churn, a little belt-tightening. It's just noise. It never affects the essential divisions. It certainly doesn't affect the people who are actually delivering results." His eyes flicked to me for a fraction of a second, the unspoken message clear. That's what happens to the unimportant people, the dabblers. He had no idea. The sheer blissful arrogance of his ignorance was breathtaking. He was a man standing on a trapdoor bragging about the strength of the floorboards. The clock in the hall began to make a new sound, a whirring, mechanical gathering of gears as it prepared to strike the hour. The final countdown had begun. My entire life seemed to flash before my eyes, but it wasn't the good parts. It was a highlight reel of every humiliation I had suffered in this very room. I could see myself at 16, trying to explain my fascination with building a computer from parts, only for Leo to call me a geek and my father to tell me to find a more social hobby. I could see myself at 22, fresh out of community college, being told my certificate was nice, but no substitute for a real degree like Leo's. I could see all the Thanksgivings, all the Easters, all the family dinners where I had shrunk myself down to nothing to avoid the sting of their casual dismissal. All those years I had believed their version of me. I had internalized their judgment. I had accepted my role as the lesser child, the one who was a little lost, the one who wasn't living up to her potential. But in the quiet darkness of my tiny office, fueled by coffee and code, another version of me had been growing, a person they had never met, and she was about to walk through the door. The first chime of the clock rang out deep and sonorous. Bong. It was a signal. It was the sound of a new world beginning. Bong. I looked at their faces, these people who thought they knew me. My mother smiling fondly at her successful son. My father content in his Scotch-induced haze. My brother secure in his castle of arrogance. They were all characters in a play, and they had no idea the curtain was about to fall. Bong. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, through the legs of my chair, and up into my very bones. This was it, the moment where everything changed. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, I realized with a sudden, shocking clarity, the moment I had been working toward my entire life. Bong. The clock chimed 3 more times, each note a step closer to the future. Then, silence. It was 7 o'clock. The final chime of the grandfather clock faded, leaving behind a thick, expectant silence. The casual conversations had stopped, hushed by the formal announcement of the hour. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the whole room were holding its collective breath. My grandmother, the architect of this moment, set down her teacup with a quiet, deliberate grace. The delicate sound of porcelain meeting saucer was the only noise in the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not create a spectacle. She simply turned her head, her gaze bypassing Leo entirely, and looked directly at me. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud or dramatic. It was perfectly calm, perfectly clear, and it carried across the table with the devastating precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Clara, dear," she said, her eyes holding mine, "isn't that the division your company just bought?" The words hung in the air for a full second, nonsensical and bizarre to everyone who heard them. It was a question so far outside the realm of their reality that their brains couldn't immediately process it. Clara's company, the one they thought of as a part-time project, bought a division of Innovatech, the corporate giant? The statement simply did not compute. The first sound that broke the spell was the sharp, ugly clatter of metal on ceramic. Leo's dessert fork slipped from his limp fingers and fell onto his plate. The noise was startlingly loud in the silent room. I watched his face. It was a fascinating, horrifying spectacle. The smug, self-satisfied mask dissolved in an instant, like sand washing away in a wave. It was replaced by a slack-jawed confusion, then a flicker of disbelief, and finally, the first creeping tendrils of dawning, sickening horror. His eyes, wide and panicked, darted from my grandmother's placid face to my own. My mother was the first to speak, her voice a bewildered whisper. "Eleanor, what are you talking about? What does Clara have to do with Leo's company?" But no one was listening to her. My Uncle Robert, a man who lived and breathed financial news, was already fumbling for his smartphone. A second later, my Aunt Carol did the same. Suddenly, the dim, warm light of the dining room was punctuated by the cold, blue glow of phone screens, illuminating faces taut with a frantic, urgent curiosity. I could hear the furious tapping of fingers on glass, the sound of a desperate search for answers. It was Uncle Robert who found it first. He gasped, a small, sharp intake of breath. He didn't say anything. He just stared at his screen, his face pale. "What is it?" my father demanded, his voice tight. Uncle Robert didn't look up. He just read the words from the screen, his voice thin and reedy, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was saying. Logiflow Technologies announced today it has completed its acquisition of the Enterprise Solutions division of Innovatech. He trailed off, but my Aunt Carol had found it too. She continued, her voice trembling slightly. The deal, valued in the 9 figures, is a major strategic move for the rapidly growing logistics software company led by founder and CEO Clara Evans. CEO Clara Evans. The name, my name, dropped into the center of the room like a stone into a perfectly still pond. The ripples of its impact spread outwards, shattering the reflection of the world they had all believed in. And then came the silence. It was a different kind of silence this time. It wasn't the sleepy post-dinner lull. It was a deep, profound, and surgical silence. It was the sound of 2 decades of family hierarchy being dismantled in an instant. It was the sound of my father's perception of his children being violently inverted. It was the sound of my mother realizing the child she had pitied was more successful than the one she had worshipped. It was the sound of Leo's entire identity, a cathedral built on arrogance and praise, crashing down into rubble. I watched as their brains struggled to reconcile the Clara they had kept in a small, neat box with the CEO whose name was now glowing on their phone screens. I saw the shock, the disbelief, the confusion. On my father's face, I saw the beginnings of a deep and profound shame. On my mother's, I saw a bewildering mix of horror and a flicker of something I had never seen before, awe. And Leo, he was no longer looking at anyone. His eyes were glued to his own phone, his face the color of ash. He was reading my name, CEO Clara Evans, over and over again, as if hoping the words would change. In that moment, I felt no triumph, no desire to say, "I told you so." The victory was not in their shock, but in the silence itself. It was the silence of finally being seen. For my entire life, I had been invisible to them, my ambitions and struggles nothing more than a faint gray background to Leo's vibrant success. But now they saw me. The light from their phones was illuminating my face, but it felt like a spotlight I had built myself, powered by my own work, my own belief, my own refusal to give up. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of the truth. The surgical silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. No one seemed to know how to breathe, let alone speak. The only reality in the room was the cold blue light from the phone screens, each one a mirror reflecting a truth that was impossible to deny. It was my mother who finally broke the spell, her voice a fragile whisper that barely disturbed the air. "Clara, you bought Leo's company?" The question was a testament to how little she understood. In her mind, companies were monolithic things, and her son stood at the center of his. She was trying to fit this new information into her old worldview, and it wouldn't go. I took a slow sip of water, my movements calm and measured. I looked at her, not with anger or triumph, but with the simple clarity of a teacher explaining a difficult concept. "Not the whole company, Mom," I said, my voice steady and even. "Just his underperforming division." The words were precise, clinical, and devastating. I wasn't just a wealthy person on a shopping spree. I was a CEO making a strategic acquisition, underperforming. The word hung in the air, a direct contradiction to the grand picture Leo had painted of his essential, powerful department just minutes before. I let it land, and then I delivered the final crushing blow. Logiflow is a lean company. We value innovation and efficiency, so we'll be keeping their best engineers, of course, but we will be restructuring the existing leadership. It was corporate speak, clean and impersonal, but everyone at that table understood its brutal meaning. Uncle Robert, who had been staring at me with his mouth agape, flinched. My father just sank back in his chair, looking at me as if for the first time. He was a man watching a lifetime of assumptions burn to the ground. My mother just shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I couldn't tell if it was a tear for Leo's fall or for her own failure to see me. Perhaps it was for both. But my focus, and the focus of the conversation, had been Leo, and he was no longer part of the family drama. He was trapped in his own private hell, staring at the screen of his phone. His face was a pale, expressionless mask, but I could see the frantic, terrified thoughts racing behind his eyes. He was reading the headline, yes, but he was also reading the subtext. He was replaying years of his own condescension in his mind. Every smug comment at a Thanksgiving dinner, every dismissive joke about my project, every time he had looked at me with that signature smirk of pity and superiority. He had spent a decade building his identity on the idea that he was a brilliant man in a serious industry, while I was a clueless girl playing with toys. And now, the toy had just eaten the industry. The hobby had just bought the career. I watched him as the final, most horrifying realization landed. It wasn't just that his little sister was now a powerful CEO. It was that his little sister was now, effectively, his boss. The person whose opinion he had never once valued would now determine his future. The words restructuring the existing leadership were no longer just corporate jargon. They were a personal threat. They were the sound of his world collapsing. I saw the shift in his eyes, the moment the shock curdled into raw, undiluted humiliation. He had built his castle on my perceived failure, and I had just bought the land it was sitting on. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a tectonic reversal. The arrogance that had been Leo's lifeblood had evaporated, leaving a vacuum of shock and fear in its place. No one was looking at him anymore. All their attention, all their focus was on me, but their gazes were hesitant, uncertain. They were looking at a stranger. They had spent so long seeing a ghost at the table that they didn't know how to speak to the person who was suddenly, undeniably real. The Evans family hierarchy had been rewritten, and I was the author. The silence that followed was no longer about the news. It was about their terrifying uncertainty of what I would write on the next page. The vacuum of shock did not last long. It was soon filled by a chaotic, clumsy rush of questions. The initial stun had worn off, and my relatives, seeing their world upended, scrambled to understand the new landscape. They tried to understand me the only way they knew how, through the language of money, status, and logistics. The niece they had ignored for 2 decades was suddenly the most interesting person in the room, and they swarmed around me, not with affection, but with a frantic, grasping curiosity. "A 9-figure deal, Clara?" Uncle Robert asked, leaning forward, his earlier shock replaced by a salesman's avaricious gleam. "What was the exact valuation? Did you use debt financing, or was it a cash deal? Your investors must be thrilled." Aunt Carol, the lawyer, jumped in before I could answer. "How many employees are coming over in the acquisition? You'll have a nightmare of an HR integration on your hands. Are you anticipating any legal challenges from the redundant leadership?" They peppered me with questions about office space in Boston, about revenue projections, about my company's stock options. They were trying to build a new box for me, one made of financial data and corporate strategy. If they could quantify my success, perhaps they could comprehend it. They were no longer talking to their niece. They were talking to a business case study, a mysterious success story they desperately wanted to understand so they could claim a small piece of it. I answered their questions calmly, my voice professional and detached. I gave them polite, vague, corporate-approved answers. "We're very pleased with the terms of the deal. We have a robust integration plan in place. Our primary focus is on retaining top engineering talent. I was a CEO in a boardroom, not a daughter at a family dinner. Their approval, which I had once craved with a desperate childish ache, was no longer something I needed. Its arrival felt anticlimactic, like a letter that had been lost in the mail for 10 years. While this chaotic interrogation was happening, my grandmother sat serenely amidst the storm. She had taken no part in the frantic questioning. Her work was done. She simply sipped her chamomile tea, which must have been cold by now, with a small, deeply satisfied smile on her face. She was the quiet conductor watching her symphony reach its powerful, chaotic crescendo. Our eyes met across the table, and in that shared glance was a complete and perfect understanding. This was our victory, a secret we had shared, a plan we had executed flawlessly. The end of the dinner was painfully awkward. The usual loud goodbyes and back-patting were gone. Instead, there were hesitant, respectful murmurs directed at me. "It was wonderful to see you, Clara." "We should talk soon." Leo was the first to leave. He didn't say a word to anyone. He simply stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wood floor, and walked out of the room, a ghost leaving his own haunting. He didn't even say goodbye to his own mother. As I was putting on my coat in the hallway, my father approached me. He stood a few feet away, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked lost, a stranger in his own home. He looked older than he had 3 hours ago, his shoulders slumped with a weight that wasn't there before dinner. He wouldn't or couldn't meet my eyes. "Clara," he began, his voice thick and gravelly with an emotion I had never heard from him before. It was regret. I never understood. What you were building. All this time. With your computer, that little office, I thought. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to speak the full truth of his dismissal. He finally looked at me and his eyes were glistening. "I should have paid more attention," he whispered. "I should have tried harder to understand." This was it. The apology I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. The validation I had ached for. But hearing the words now, they didn't bring the rush of triumphant satisfaction I had always imagined. Instead, they brought a profound and aching sadness. A sadness for all the wasted years. A sadness for this man, my father, who had been so blinded by his narrow, rigid definition of success that he had completely missed the real story of his own daughter. I felt a sudden, unexpected pang of pity for him. I looked at his tired, regretful face, and I gave him the only truth I had left. "It's okay, Dad," I said, and my voice was surprisingly gentle. "Not everyone gets it." I paused, then added the final, necessary piece. "Until they have to." It was not exactly forgiveness, but it was a form of closure. It was an acknowledgement of his failure, but also a release. I was stating a simple fact. His understanding had finally arrived, but it had arrived long after I had learned to live without it. I no longer needed him to see me. I could finally see myself. Monday morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, glinting off the glass towers of the Boston skyline. The view was a constant, tangible reminder of how far I had come. This quiet, spacious office was a world away from the windowless, flickering shoebox where Logi Flow had been born. That first office had been a place of desperate, frantic creation, filled with the hum of secondhand servers and the smell of stale coffee. This office was a place of calm, quiet power. It was my space, built not just with code, but with years of relentless, unacknowledged work. My assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Ms. Evans, your 9 o'clock is here. It's Leo Evans." "Send him in, thank you," I replied, my voice perfectly even. A moment later, the door opened and Leo walked in. The word "walked" isn't quite right. He shuffled in, his movements hesitant and uncertain. He looked smaller. It wasn't just a trick of the light in my large office. His expensive, tailored suit, usually a suit of armor for his arrogance, seemed to hang off his frame. His confident posture, the one he used to command attention at the Thanksgiving table, was gone, replaced by a visible slump, the posture of a man who has been defeated. He looked utterly lost and out of place in my world. I gestured to the chair opposite my large, polished desk. "Leo, please, have a seat." He sat, his movement stiff. The dynamic was a perfect inversion of our entire lives. I was in the position of power behind the desk, in control. He was the supplicant, the visitor, waiting for me to speak. I didn't. I let the silence stretch, letting him sit with the full, uncomfortable weight of the new reality. It was his meeting to begin. He cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on a spot on my desk, unable to look at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was a quiet, hollow murmur, a ghost of its former booming confidence. "Clara," he started, then stopped. He took a shaky breath. "All this time, all those years, I looked at what you were doing, and I thought you were just playing." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were filled with a raw, painful confusion. "I thought you were just playing at tech." There it was, the core of it all, the fundamental misunderstanding that had defined our relationship. He had judged my life's work as a child's game. Hearing him say it out loud, I felt no anger. I felt no satisfaction. I felt a strange, quiet pity. I leaned forward slightly, my hands folded on the desk. My response was not about him, or about us, or about the past. It was the simple, hard-won philosophy I had learned during my long years in the wilderness of my family's indifference. "Real success," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "doesn't need an audience." The words landed in the quiet office with absolute finality. It was the truest thing I knew. I hadn't built my company for him, or for my parents, or for any of them. I hadn't done it to prove them wrong. I had done it because I had to, because the drive to create, to build, to solve the puzzle was the most real and vital part of me. Their applause would have been nice, but my work was never contingent upon it. My success was valid whether they witnessed its creation or not. Leo just stared at me for a long moment, the meaning of my words slowly dawning on him. He finally gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was humbled. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the harsh light of reality. There was no argument left in him. He was just an employee, sitting in front of his new boss. I shifted my tone then, becoming the CEO. "Your division has a lot of potential, but it's been mismanaged. We're going to make some significant changes. Your role for now will be to facilitate the transition of your teams. You'll report to the new head of integration." I was professional, impersonal, and fair. The ultimate power was not in firing him, but in treating him just like any other asset in a corporate acquisition. His future was now a business decision, not a personal one. He nodded again, accepting his diminished role without a word of protest. A few minutes later, the meeting was over. He stood up, gave me one last unreadable look, and walked out of my office. As the door closed behind him, I swiveled my chair to face the window, looking out at the sprawling city. I had thought this moment would feel like revenge. I had imagined a fiery, triumphant victory. But it wasn't that at all. It was quiet. It was calm. The war was over, not with a bang, but with a quiet conversation on a sunny Monday morning. I hadn't wanted to destroy my brother. I had just wanted him and all of them to see me. And now they did. The sweetest justice, I realized, isn't revenge. It's the respect that was always deserved, finally showing up to the table. The end of the story.